She didn't cry. That's what everyone remembers. The moment the envelope landed in her hands, the ballroom held its breath, expecting a breakdown. But what they saw instead was a woman who simply exhaled. Eleanor hadn't touched her wine all evening. She hadn't clinked her glass during the toasts. She barely spoke a word to her husband Daniel, tech magnate, philanthropist, billionaire. But she smiled at the waiters. She asked the pianist for her favorite song. She kissed the ring on her left hand like she knew it would be the last time. What most people missed was the way her eyes had scanned the room before he stood. She had already counted the guests, already calculated the odds. So when he tapped his glass, cleared his throat and said, "I have an announcement," she didn't flinch, because she already knew. And what happened next would not just end a marriage. It would expose secrets worth millions and tear reputations apart one whisper at a time. What made it worse, at least for Daniel, was that he'd planned it to humiliate her, to show the world he was moving on, that she had been replaced, discarded, that she didn't matter. But he underestimated the one thing Eleanor had always mastered: timing. And as the crowd leaned in, expecting a scandal delivered from one side, they got a reckoning from the other. Because Eleanor had spent months preparing for this night. Not with revenge in mind, but with precision and silence. And when she finally opened the envelope, what she said next turned an entire gala against the man who had once ruled every room he entered. He thought she'd beg. Instead, she made him regret ever thinking she'd stay quiet. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was this woman? Quiet, elegant, and rarely photographed. A wife without scandals, without interviews, without headlines. Eleanor Barrington had become the kind of presence most people overlooked, especially beside a man like Daniel. He was the one shaking hands with governors, closing deals with CEOs, making Forbes covers look routine. But Eleanor, she was always there, just never seen. She hosted, smiled, waved, then stepped back into the shadow Daniel cast without ever stumbling. But that night, under the weight of crystal chandeliers and watchful eyes, something shifted. Because what Daniel didn't realize was that Eleanor had never been absent. She had been watching, listening, remembering. And what did she remember that made the room turn cold when she looked at him? Why that night? Why that room? Why those guests? The gala was his world, his ground. And yet the moment she opened that envelope, the spotlight stopped following Daniel and found her instead. What was inside those documents that made her nod, just once, before laying them gently on the table? What had she uncovered during all those years of silence, while he built an empire on her quiet loyalty? Why did she smile before she stood? And how did she turn an entire ballroom from gasping to applauding? Was this a woman simply reacting to betrayal? Or had Eleanor Barrington, wife of one of America's most influential men, orchestrated a reckoning long in the making, and chosen this night, this room, and this moment to end it all? Eleanor met Daniel Barrington when she was just 25, fresh out of Yale Law, still wearing the edge of courtroom victories like armor. She had a reputation, precise, fearless, undefeated. And Daniel, he had just sold his second tech company, already hailed as the next titan of Silicon Valley. Their paths crossed at a conference in San Francisco, two minds drawn to each other not by accident, but by calculation. Daniel saw in Eleanor a sharpness he admired. Eleanor saw in Daniel a fire she wasn't sure she could trust. But when he pursued her, it wasn't with charm, it was with strategy. Lavish dinners, bookstore rendezvous. He quoted her published legal work back to her like a man who had done his homework. And after only 7 months, he asked her to leave the courtroom and build something bigger with him. In the beginning, it was a partnership. Eleanor drafted contracts, negotiated deals, and dismantled legal threats before they ever made it to his desk. They called her the lawyer in heels, the one you didn't see coming until your signature was already on the dotted line. But as Daniel's empire expanded, so did the distance between them. Suddenly, she was less lawyer, more hostess. Her days were filled with gala prep, brand meetings, and approving flower arrangements for events she didn't even want to attend. The Eleanor who once stood her ground in federal courtrooms now stood silently beside her husband as he collected awards she helped him earn. The shift was subtle, almost elegant. Over the years, she became part of the background, always present, always poised, but increasingly invisible. Photos from public events show it clearly. At first, she's beside him, hand in hand, then slightly behind, then blurred in the corner while he raises champagne flutes with actresses and investors. But what no one seemed to notice was that Eleanor hadn't vanished. She hadn't retreated. She had repositioned. She wasn't giving up. She was gathering. She listened at fundraisers. She smiled at mistresses who didn't know she knew. She memorized names, dates, account numbers whispered when Daniel thought she wasn't paying attention. 17 years passed, not in silence, but in observation. While Daniel was praised for building, Eleanor was preparing for something else. Because Eleanor Barrington wasn't weak, she wasn't tired. And she certainly wasn't done. She wasn't fading. She was waiting.
It was the Barrington Foundation Gala, held every November without fail. A night drenched in opulence, gold leaf programs, a 12-piece orchestra flown in from Vienna, and a guest list so exclusive even sitting U.S. senators had to RSVP twice. The venue, a glass-walled ballroom perched over the city skyline, glittering with crystal and ambition. The cause? Education reform. The reality? A stage for the powerful to admire themselves. And at the very center of it all, as always, was Daniel Barrington, shaking hands, taking photos, making promises he rarely kept. But this year, the attention wasn't supposed to be on the cause. It was on the show he had planned. Eleanor arrived precisely at 7:42 p.m., wearing a midnight blue silk gown and a calm that unsettled even the most seasoned socialites. She took her seat at the head table without fanfare, exchanged pleasantries with the governor's wife, and placed her linen napkin gently in her lap. If she suspected anything, she didn't show it. But Daniel? Daniel was electric, too animated, too proud, glancing at his watch like a man counting down to a private victory. Just before the dessert course, as the waitstaff glided in with champagne-poached pears and crystal flutes, a sharply dressed waiter approached Eleanor with a single item, a white envelope sealed with gold foil. She took it with a nod. No confusion, no alarm, just a breath, measured even. Then Daniel stood. He tapped the microphone once, twice. The room dimmed. Silence settled like fog. "Some news," he began, "is better shared publicly." A few in the crowd laughed nervously, unsure whether this was part of the evening's program. Then came the 6 words that shifted the energy in the room like a dropped chandelier. "My wife has just been served." There was a pause, tight and quiet. Then came the collective gasp. People looked at Eleanor, expecting collapse, rage, tears. But she didn't cry. She didn't speak. She opened the envelope with the same composure she used to open settlement offers back in her law days. She read every word. Her eyes did not flicker. Her posture did not change. Then she folded the papers neatly, placed them back in the envelope, looked up at Daniel, and said just 3 words. "That's all." What no one in that ballroom realized was that Daniel Barrington had just detonated his own empire. He thought he was embarrassing Eleanor, reducing her to a whisper in front of the most powerful people in the city. But what he had done, in fact, was give her permission, in front of cameras, investors, journalists, and heirs. He handed her the mic, and Eleanor Barrington never spoke unless she had something worth saying. Daniel had forced a scene. What he didn't know was that Eleanor had written the ending. While tabloids churned out headlines, "Barrington divorce goes public," Eleanor blindsided at Gala. Power couple implodes on stage. The woman at the center of it all said nothing. No statements, no press conferences, not a single public appearance. Eleanor Barrington vanished from the spotlight just as easily as she had once slipped into it. But silence doesn't always mean surrender. Because in the hours following the gala, something far more devastating than gossip began to spread. Daniel Barrington's empire started to crack. At 9:06 a.m. the next morning, Barrington Tech's stock dipped 7 points. By noon, it was down 13. Whispers started on trading floors about a leak, documents that had surfaced in a sealed envelope sent anonymously to financial regulators. Internal memos, off-the-record donations, foreign bank transfers. All of it pointing to one thing: deliberate, calculated deception within the very company Daniel had built his name on. Investigators were alerted, subpoenas followed, and within 72 hours, federal agents showed up at the Barrington estate. The trigger, as it turned out, had been that envelope, but not the one Daniel gave Eleanor, the one she had been quietly preparing for months. Inside was more than a divorce petition. It was evidence, financial ledgers, account histories, copies of wire transfers routed through shell charities and filtered into personal accounts under Daniel's control. Eleanor had known, and instead of confronting him in private, she made her statement in silence, backed by a paper trail no one could ignore. The most damning discovery: that the woman Daniel had been seeing, the one whose whispers had followed him through fundraisers and boardrooms, wasn't just his mistress. She was also the chief financial officer of the Barrington Foundation. And that charity gala they'd hosted, it wasn't just a fundraiser. It was part of a massive laundering scheme, using donor funds to cover private debts and inflate shareholder value through artificial philanthropic claims. Everything Daniel had built, his reputation as a tech visionary, his carefully curated image as a generous benefactor, his claim to moral superiority in the public eye, was suddenly under scrutiny. Auditors combed through years of financial records. Journalists dug up speeches. Politicians who had once accepted Daniel's donations began distancing themselves in real time. And still, Eleanor remained silent. She let the headlines tell the story. She let the numbers speak for themselves. She let Daniel, for the first time in decades, stand alone in the mess he created. Because Eleanor hadn't come to destroy him impulsively. She had come to expose him, on his stage, in his world, surrounded by his allies. And she didn't raise her voice once.
At the press conference the following week, the crowd expected fury. They expected tears, accusations, maybe even a carefully prepared statement from the woman who had just taken down a billionaire in the most public way imaginable. But Eleanor Barrington walked in wearing a black suit, her hair pulled back, her face unreadable. And she said nothing. Not a single word. She stood behind the podium while her legal counsel, flanked by accountants and investigators, stepped forward. The room fell silent, not out of respect, but out of sheer curiosity. What they got, instead of spectacle, was precision. Her team announced the official creation of the Eleanor Barrington Foundation. The mission: to provide legal aid and financial resources to women in high-control, high-power relationships. It would be headquartered in the very office space Daniel once used to host tech summits. The funding, not from donors, but from assets seized during the ongoing investigation into Daniel Barrington's financial misconduct. The plaque had already been ordered, the staff already hired. It hadn't been thrown together in the chaos following the gala. It had been planned, long before Daniel stood with his smirk and microphone. 3 weeks later, Daniel was arrested on federal charges: fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. The evidence was airtight. Anonymous tips had been cross-referenced with data pulled from hard drives and encrypted emails. The offshore accounts, the falsified reports, the fake donation receipts. It was all there. But here's where the story took a turn. Even the sharpest observers didn't see coming. Daniel hadn't just been caught. He had unknowingly handed over a confession. You see, the divorce papers Daniel had given Eleanor during the gala, his big move, the public humiliation he'd waited for, weren't the real documents. Somewhere between the printing and the delivery, Eleanor had switched them. What Daniel signed, in front of hundreds of witnesses and dozens of cameras, was not a standard petition. It was a notarized statement, carefully crafted by Eleanor's legal team, that acknowledged ownership and awareness of several key offshore assets now tied to fraudulent charity transactions.
In trying to end a marriage with dramatic flair, Daniel had walked directly into a legal trap he didn't even recognize. The arrogance, the spectacle, the timing, it all worked against him. And by the time he realized what he had signed, it was too late. The document had already been submitted as evidence, admissible, on record, sealed by his own signature. Eleanor Barrington didn't destroy Daniel with words, with shouting, or with scandal. She did it with silence, with timing, and with a plan that had been in motion for longer than anyone suspected. This wasn't just a reaction to betrayal. It was a move made by someone who had once studied law, then studied people, and then waited. And when the time came, she didn't fight for the mic. She let the papers speak. She let Daniel undo himself. Daniel Barrington now sits behind bars. The man who once gave keynote addresses on power and vision, who sat on the boards of global charities and tech giants, is now reduced to a case number and a set of court dates. His name no longer opens doors. It invites questions, headlines, suspicion. His empire, fractured by the very hands that built it, has become a cautionary tale in boardrooms across the country. But in all the chaos that followed, the investigations, the testimonies, the frozen assets, what people still whisper about isn't the downfall. It's the moment before it began. It's Eleanor Barrington's final moment in that ballroom, the one that even the photographers almost missed. After Daniel made his announcement, after she read the envelope and delivered her 3-word reply, after the room turned on him and the applause began, not loud, but slow and deliberate, Eleanor didn't rush. She stood, gathered the envelope, and with poise that couldn't be faked, walked toward the double doors. The sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor echoed louder than any speech could have. And just before she stepped outside, just before she disappeared into the night and into history, she turned back to the room. She didn't say anything. She didn't wave. She didn't make a scene. She simply looked out over the sea of stunned faces, friends, strangers, enemies, and smiled. That smile wasn't pride. It wasn't vengeance dressed up in grace. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, deeper. It was peace. The kind of peace you only earn after 17 years of biting your tongue, of being the shadow behind the spotlight, of choosing silence over spectacle until silence itself became your strength. It was the smile of a woman who had finally stepped out from behind the curtain, who had finally been heard, without ever raising her voice. Because when Daniel Barrington handed her that envelope, he thought he was ending something. A marriage, a partnership, her usefulness, her relevance. But what Daniel never understood, and what Eleanor had spent years preparing to show him, was that he wasn't ending anything. He was starting it. That night, Eleanor Barrington didn't just walk out of a gala. She walked into a new version of herself, one she had been building in pieces, patiently, quietly, methodically. And while Daniel may have written the headline, Eleanor wrote the legacy. So what do you think? Was Eleanor Barrington justified in what she did? Did she expose a lifetime of lies with poise and purpose? Or was this just another carefully crafted power play in a world where control always comes at a price? Did she wait too long? Or was her timing the very reason it worked? Was silence truly her greatest weapon? And if you were in her shoes, 17 years, countless sacrifices, public betrayal in front of everyone you once hosted, would you have done the same? Or would you have walked away without saying a word? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear the story of the millionaire heiress who faked her own death just to catch her husband cheating. Subscribe now so you don't miss that one.